Good morning, all. Friday morning show, 7 a.m., and we're ready to get started. I've got my cup of coffee in hand. And today we're starting with the first in a series on polyol pathway, uric acid, unified theory that is driving chronic metabolic diseases. Now, last week I released a video that I've been working on for basically, you could argue, over the last 5 years, because my story in all of this is that I was diagnosed with prediabetes, and I also was diagnosed with gout. And the prediabetes was really scary for me because what I was being told at the time by the medical establishment, my own doctor and so on, was that this is progressive, change to a healthy diet. That word healthy, and we're going to have some episodes on terminology, right, and what it means and how it's been twisted around on us out there. But I'm already digressing. So in any case, in my own story, at the time I was diagnosed with prediabetes, of course, I was really concerned because I was 60 years old. I'm 65 now. And I was not satisfied hearing that I had something that was progressive and that was not curable, and basically being told, don't worry about it. We have good drugs that we can feed to you, and you should be able to live, many, many decades before the various disorders set in, the kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, all of these things that end up killing diabetics. And it wasn't until I found my way to the TED Talk by Sarah Hallberg, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, that then led me to the literature, and where I've been ever since. And I'm a biochemist. You can think of me as a biochemical analyst. I don't have my own laboratory. I'm not able to do the experiments that I would if I had a laboratory, but I can read and I can think and I can talk to these guys who have been working in this area. And one of the things that you find out as soon as you start delving into the literature underneath diabetes is that there's a long history of published work that is to our advantage. Because, for example, the first paper that was published in the area of low carb was in 1921 by a doctor named Wilder. And when you look at Virta Health and their early publications, which now were many years ago, actually, I think they classify into the category of many, you can see exactly where they got their protocols from if you read that early work. And we know that when you do the groundwork here, that the low carb lifestyle has been around a really long time. The French were even using it to reverse obesity back in the mid 1700s. Anyway, that's where my entry point started. And I was able to reverse my prediabetes very quickly following the literature, which is what I did. I put the early Virta papers down on a table, and I looked at what they were feeding their patients, and I designed my lifestyle directly based on that, not based on what was swirling around on the surface of the internet. I want to make that point. I went to the literature. And my daughter and I got together because when we saw that I could reverse my diabetes, and then came the gout issue, I'll deal with that in a second, it occurred to us, well, we could use science to help other people too, because, when you're dealing with the medical establishment in this area, like my own doctor, when I put the Virta papers down in front of her back then, she just told me, I'm not having this conversation with you. You do what you want. And if you're able to make your situation better, then, kudos to you, but I will not have any conversations with you about this lifestyle on this level. That's up to you what you want to do. Now, I no longer have her as a doctor, and I could do full episodes on what it's like to find doctors that actually know about this methodology that you can use to reverse diabetes, but that you can also use to improve your health overall. And that's kind of what we're going to be getting at today. But the lesson for me back then was that, okay, we know a lot more about metabolic disease than anyone is letting on about. And there is a lot more research that's published in this area and areas that feed into this than anyone knows about. And so for me, it began, I've been on a crusade with this. The other thing that was sitting in the background was my gout. And the worry back then that I had was that I heard rumors circulating, even at some conferences I went to, that when somebody is reversing diabetes by cutting the carbs, that your uric acid goes up. So I started pounding the ground. I figured, okay, if there is literature about diabetes reversal, especially reaching back into the early 1900s, then I wonder what is out there about uric acid. And I started tracking that and going back into the literature, and I was astounded about what I found. And essentially in 2023, what has essentially and continues to be ignored by the medical establishment. And it was out of that work that led me to Dr. Richard Johnson's vast body of publications, over 700 decades of work in this area of fructose uric acid metabolism. And that's what got me here to today, because I know that you can put gout in remission. I've done it myself, and I'm gout-free today. The only time over the last several years that I've had gout flares, it's because I've been doing N1 experiments on myself to manipulate uric acid, and every single time I do that and I get a sudden acute rise in uric acid, or I bring it way down and I do it suddenly, quite often I'll end up with a gout flare. Why have I been doing that? Because I have a sincere, deep interest in trying to educate and help the people that are willing to listen, and let them know that you can, in fact, either reverse or put into remission these metabolic diseases. And what my effort is today is the first in a video series to try and bring polyol-fructose uric acid metabolism down to a layman's point of view. Now, the video that I put out last week, which is highly referenced, and in fact, there's a paper in the works right now, so writing this up formally to be submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. The reason for the sophistication is because 5 years ago, I made the commitment, not only to myself, but to the people that I talk to and the people that I coach, to always make decisions based on the science and what the science says, what we can learn from the science. And then we make decisions about what we eat. And then the other aspects of lifestyle recuperation, if you will, you know, the other issues here. What are the issues surrounding sleep and exercise, right? Not to stand on the bandwagon and just go off about this, but to actually look at what the science says and how those issues feed into what we're putting in our mouth. So today is the beginning of providing videos that are produced more on a simplistic level. So where I'm going to start with this first is to review what the statistics look like. And as you might expect by somebody like me who's in this field, is that we see the numbers of people who are suffering metabolic diseases is on the rise. And why is this going on? Well, the reason is because with my generation, this business all started with the initial shift from the way our parents were eating. The nutritional guidelines were published in the late 70s and early 80s, and we saw this massive shift towards what we call the standard American way of eating, the advent of processed food coming into our population. So for the children of that would be me, and we're all in our 60s now, the boomers, right, that are aging out of the workforce and so on, who have this significant rise in metabolic diseases compared to our parents. But here's the thing, we had children and they came into this whole way of eating earlier, and they're having children who are coming into this way of eating even earlier, right? And so one of the things that we see in the statistics is the number of people now that are, as they become adults, right, 18 years old or older, we see that issues like diabetes and the obesity is significantly moving down into younger ages. And it's because this cycle of life, the arrival of this type of food into this environment is happening earlier and earlier. And in fact, it's starting in the womb, because mothers that are eating this way, the fast food, the processed food, the high level of sugar and so on, is happening while the baby is in gestation, right? And so these children, once they're born, they've already been exposed, right? The predisposition to these decisions, this dysfunction, right? That is driven by this way of eating is already happening. So you see that here. I mean, we're almost at 15% of type 2 diabetes in the adult population. 38% of the adult population is pre-diabetic. When you combine those statistics and just say, all right, how many of us out there over 18 are either on track to be fully diabetic or pre-diabetic, and now the combined percentage is over 50% easily. We see that the obese is at 42%, but when we add in the number of people that are significantly overweight, that percentage is over 70%. I think it's around 75% now. And I'm going to digress a little bit here, because the problem with obesity is that we've normalized this. We've literally normalized this now in our culture. And you can see that here. This is a clip from a nightly, and I know a lot of you guys that are younger, you're not watching the nightly news, but if you're a boomer, you probably are. And I want you to see this clip, because this goes to the issue of normalization. Boom, right there, right? You've got, I call her the dancing lady. She's obese, and in part of that advertisement, they show her shopping, right? Trying on different dresses that are now oversized for her. And we're making this argument that the obesity is perfectly fine and that it's about body acceptance and all of this, and I could go on about this, but even on my own level, the last time I went shopping for pants, I had to move to the kids section because, over the last 5 years and shifting away from sugar and eating a low carb lifestyle, I lost 33 pounds. And now when I go in to shop for pants in the adult section, I can't find any. They don't fit me. That's how significant this shift in our population has been, right? I have to go to the kids section to find my Levi's. It's not trivial. It's easier for me to shop online to find Levi's that actually fit me than it is for me to go to, I won't mention names, to easier than going to a big box store. So we've normalized this concept, and like a lot of the health coaches and medical doctors that talk to you in this space, when you go back and I was doing this yesterday to prepare for this talk today, when you go back to and you look at photographs from the 1950s, beach photographs, you just don't see the obesity that you see now on our beaches, and especially in the lower age groups. And for example, I specialize in the area of gout, and there's a significant number of calls that I get, Zoom meetings that are happening between me and people that are in their 30s and are not only suffering from obesity, but suffering from the other comorbidities that are associated with it, the diabetes and the gout. There's a great deal of frustration and anger that are in their voices when we're having this conversation, and a great deal of pushback about the fact that, you know, what they want to hear from me is that there's a pill that they can take that's going to make all this okay. And that's something that I'm going to address later in the talk, because there is no pill. And there are other medical doctors. I'm not a medical doctor, but there are other medical doctors that talk to you about this in this space, that there is no pill for metabolic diseases, because at the center of all this is the mitochondria. And the best way to address this issue is to go after this by changing your lifestyle. And the vast majority of it is what you're putting in your mouth, right? If you try to take a pill for this, or you try to exercise your way out of it, you're not going to have success with that unless you also address what you're eating. That's the truth of the matter. All right. We see that, and this statistic for me was shocking, but also it carries a lot of weight because of my extended family. And for those people that are older that are listening to this, over 60 years old, 76% have cardiovascular issues. And I know even in my extended family, there are people that have multiple stents and refuse to consider the argument about altering how they eat. It's sad, it's shocking, and it's too bad. We see that the incidence of gout is going up. There's over 12 million people in the US right now that suffer from it. The percentage is up from 3 to 4% to 4.68%. And a lot of people sitting out there are going to go, what's 0.68%? How big a deal is that? Well, when you consider the fact that on the last talk that I gave, you know, I was still using the statistic that we're at about 8 or 9 million people. I'll call it 8.5 million people that suffer from gout. Now we're at 12 million. So this percentage is continuing to rise at a fairly alarming rate. And then when you consider what percentage of our population is walking around with high uricemic acid, right? High uric acid. The number's over 51 million now, and that's more people than we have type 2 diabetes. And the medical establishment, while they love to do epidemiological studies, right? The problem is every single epidemiological study, every observational study where they look at a group of people and they ask the question, how many of you have high uric acid? And how many of you also suffer from cardiovascular disease? There is a super strong association with that. We also know when we look at molecular studies, these are the ones that I favor that actually have controls and look at the relationship between uric acid and other proteins that are directly involved or have been shown with evidence to be directly involved in cardiovascular disease. There's a strong relationship between those proteins like myeloperoxidase and uric acid. And that's especially worrying. So the fact that we have 20% of our population walking around with high uric acid, I don't think that's trivial. And I think we need to be pushing on our establishment to do more fundamental studies to find out what the real risk is involved in this. We need more molecular studies, we need more animal studies, and we need more clinical studies for sure. And then lastly, chronic kidney disease is definitely on the rise. And just to put this in another way of thinking, when we shift this story to a more specialized aspect of it, and this is an area where I work, and we ask the question, if you are a gout sufferer, what are the other comorbidities which you likely suffer, and it's extraordinary. You see that if you suffer from gout, that 74% of us also have high blood pressure. 71% have some level of kidney disease. Over half are obese. A full quarter suffer from type 2 diabetes at the same time. A full quarter usually suffer also from kidney stones. And then roughly 10 to 14% suffer from heart attacks and stroke. So if you suffer from gout, the likelihood that you are not suffering from another comorbidity is really small. And when you extend this idea and you go out and you say to somebody, okay, somebody who's morbidly obese, what other comorbidities do you suffer from? What you're going to find is that they suffer from other stuff. And this comes back to that normalization in regard to these chronic diseases, right? Because the drug manufacturers want to make it okay for you to be type 2 diabetic. Oh, well, we've got pills for you. It's not okay, right? You aren't going to get better by taking the pill. You need to address what the underlying cause. And we know enough from the science to know what the drivers are, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So when we look at the body of fructose uric acid metabolism, and back when I got started with this 5 years ago, I think it was fair to say that the majority of it for sure was coming out of Johnson's laboratory along with his collaborating laboratories, over 700 publications, decades of work. And we know that fructose uric acid metabolism, based on not only cell and molecular work, but also on numerous, too numerous to count animal studies, and also clinical work with humans, that fructose uric acid drives not only gout, but kidney disease, diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, Alzheimer's, and dementia. And there are very recent papers that show the relationship between polyol pathway and the opening of fructose uric acid metabolism in the brain, and the dysfunction that results from that, and its relationship to causing directly or leading to the presentation of dementia and Alzheimer's like behaviors. And then finally, sugar and alcohol addiction. There are significant behavioral aspects to this I'm going to be addressing in a simplistic level today. When we look at the biochemistry, and don't worry, this is the only technical slide I am going to show this morning. And we ask the question, well, how is this working? The first thing that one needs to do to understand this is to step back and recognize that our biochemical pathways are not operating in an individual setting. They operate in an integrated fashion. And the shift, for example, from glycolysis, which I show here in gray with its connections to the mitochondria, glycolysis, for example, when it's operating under low glucose conditions, where the first rate limiting step enzyme, hexokinase, is a happy camper, which is going to be a glucose concentration that is 5 millimolar, approximately in that range or less. The glucose that's being funneled into glycolysis at that point, the purpose of it is to produce substrate level energy currency. That currency is ATP, and glycolysis producing enough of it so that the cellular functions that are needed in the background in order, and the model system that we're looking at here is at the level of the liver, that the ATP that we're producing is adequate enough for the cellular functions that are needed. The main thing being the production of pyruvate and lactate. Lactate, in fact, is the terminal product of glycolysis. It's being produced under low glucose conditions at a proportionality of about 10-to-1 lactate to pyruvate. The pyruvate and the lactate enter into the mitochondria, where they are converted through a number of connections into energy currency, ATP. This is where the bulk of the ATP is being produced, which is an energy currency of the cell. And you can think of it as molecular money, right? It costs money to do things. It costs money for me to sit here and I'm using energy right now to think, to talk, to wave my hands and so on. The other thing under low glucose conditions that is important to remember is that the pool of fatty acids that we have in the liver are being utilized by the mitochondria also to produce energy. Now, things change. When we have a meal, especially a standard American meal, and I am going to go to some length this morning to show you actual examples of this, where we activate the polyol pathway. And how this happens is when the glucose rises above 5 millimolar. And when that happens, there are two enzymes that work synergistically together to open the polyol pathway and also fructose uric acid metabolism. And those two enzymes are glucokinase and aldose reductase. They work synergistically. They work together. Their activity is changed from being inactive enzymes to active enzymes by the elevation of glucose. Also, the very small amounts of fructose that can be present when we see this shift in glucose. And we see that the polyol pathway is active not only in the liver, but also brain, adipose, muscle, intestine, endothelial layer of the cardiovascular system. This is very important. This is most likely the biochemistry that's driving the cardiovascular disease that we see, especially in older individuals like myself who are eating the standard American diet, but actually, in my opinion, going guns on the standard American diet with the elevation of added sugars and so on that are involved in that lifestyle. The chondrocyte, which is the biologically important cell in our joints, which is involved in the gout flare, but also rheumatoid arthritis. The rheumatoid arthritis and gout share at the center of these inflammatory events driven by uric acid. Perhaps the difference between rheumatoid arthritis and gout is the propensity in one case to form crystals, whereas in the other case, not forming crystals. And then lastly, we know now about the existence of the polyol pathway in the pancreas. And fructose does influence insulin secretion. It doesn't do it directly, but it is involved in this. I talked about this in the video that I released last week that was super technical about the science behind this, that is all very well referenced and so on. So once we open this pathway, we see that there's an acute decline in ATP at the level of the liver. We see that there's an acute decline in phosphate, and we see the sudden acute rise in uric acid. Uric acid on an intracellular basis during the acute rise, it operates as a signaling molecule. This is not some sort of random waste product of metabolism that is inert, that is somehow causing problems because of its elevated concentration in some non-specific way. All right, that's not uric acid. It is a signaling molecule. And when it rises to the degree that it does during this metabolism, it downregulates the mitochondria. That's why I'm making an argument that both on the pathway level and at the level of mitochondria, we have a shift in state. And that state has an elevation of systemic inflammation, which from an evolutionary point of view was to stimulate the immune system. We see the dysregulation or the alteration in nitric oxide signaling, which going back to the endothelial layer, is going to alter blood pressure. So that's why when we look at somebody who suffers from diabetes, obesity, gout sufferers, this is why you see this overlap of symptoms, right? One of the things that seems to be in common with all these people is high blood pressure. The timing and the concentration of macronutrients that are reaching the liver and the pancreas and then the liver in the portal vein circulation matters. And we are going to talk in a minute about what those are. But this is something that is overlooked when we're talking about how these pathways are opened. It has to do with the amount of glucose and fructose and alcohol, salt, added sugars, and all of these components that are arriving at the liver in essentially a short duration of time in relatively high concentrations, and bam, you will have the opening of fructose uric acid metabolism. And one of the key things that people have not been talking about over the years now is the influence that the polyol pathway has on this. I believe that this is literally like a light switch. The relationship between glucokinase and aldose reductase is instrumental in throwing this switch wide open. We then have the first enzyme, fructokinase, that converts the endogenous fructose that's being produced into fructose 1-phosphate with this literal cascade, the overproduction of the uric acid, which is a signaling molecule that through a whole number of interactions is changing the state of mitochondria. We see what happens in the liver is that there's a shift in state from burning to a shift in state to storage, the production of fat synthesis, glycogen, it's systemic inflammation, alteration of nitric oxide signaling, a significant rise in hyperinsulinemia, along with insulin resistance downstream, and voila. When this pathway is open chronically all day long, every single day, week in, week out, and this turns into decades. That's why someone like me goes to the doctor at 60 years old, and they come home with a diagnosis of prediabetes or worse, the obesity epidemic, and so on down the road. Now, enough of the intensity. Here's what we're going to talk about next, and that has to do with what, at least briefly, what kinds of foods are opening this pathway. And the reason for the slide I'm showing you here is because one of the things that I've learned over the years is that one of the barriers that I have as a coach, with over 5 years of experience now and working with everyone from really serious type 2 diabetes to gout to chronic kidney disease, is this argument about healthy diet, eating healthily, and the lifestyle that's being led. So the origin of this slide, where did it come from? And this is from somebody that I go climbing with, who recently has come up, like so many of us in our 60s, with some metabolic issues, who right away when I suggested this could have to do with the amount of sugar consumption and so on in their lifestyle, bam, the pushback. And that pushback was, I gave up sugar a long time ago. I eat a healthy diet, and so on. All right. So we're out climbing all day long, right? And we come back to where we're staying, and in a 15-minute period on essentially an empty stomach, this is what was consumed. And we're looking at the banana that went down, 27 grams of hyperglycemia coming in there. There was a candy bar. Honestly, in full disclosure, I don't remember the name of the bar that was consumed. So I chose, well, I shouldn't mention the name here. I picked what I think is a fairly typical chocolate bar. There's 28 grams of sugar in there, but there was also, and this is pretty standard in processed food, there's also salt in there. There's also umami. All of these factors, if even taken individually, are going to open this pathway. The polyol is going to get blasted wide open. And then was the yogurt. and this is something that I find is just blatantly uniform. The fruit and the yogurt, I don't care who it is I've talked to over the years, and especially in my extended family, there is so much pushback against this. And this is a typical, what I'm showing here is my best memory of exactly what was eaten in that 15-minute time frame. 18 grams of sugar. The nutritional label is next door to that if you want to pause the video and read about what's in there. The combined sugars that were consumed in that 15-minute period on an empty stomach was 73 grams. This was right before we ate dinner. All right. It's just, for me, this is like an unbelievable thing because of literally the argument that we face out here as influencers by people that we talk to, because we get this all the time. I'm eating a healthy diet. I gave up sugar. I gave up sugar. Look at this, in 15 minutes. And that was before dinner. And that particular individual ate a standard American meal, meaning that if you look down at the plate, the presence of carbohydrates was like, that it was what they would consider normal. And usually the amount of shock that goes into this, right? I recently had some consultations where someone asked me, Dr. Pete, how much of potato are you going to have on your plate? And I was like, well, I'm not going to have any on my plate. But if you're shifting to a whole real food diet without substantially cutting into carbs, then maybe I would have a tablespoon. And I literally, if a brick could have come through the screen at that point, it would have. All right. The concept that you would drop that down like that was relatively foreign. All right. Here are, and I picked these because for different reasons, but the commonality of them. So I'm going to start with the pancakes, because one of the areas that I work in that is unavoidable is dealing with the extended family and the social aspects of that. Because every time we get together, I'm always, I become a focal point for these interactions. It's like, because they know that I eat low carb and that I don't, and that I'm not going to partake in a lot of the things that are going to hit the table during that meal. And one of the areas of argument, the pushback that I always get with this is that, well, we're the grandparents, and this is a very recent thing that actually happened. We're the grandparents, and when the grandchildren come to visit, we want to teach them how to cook. And that's how the pancakes got here, because they're literally teaching these kids how to cook stuff like that. And hello, people, I'm sorry to tell you this, and I hope that you're not offended, but that's going to blast open polyol pathway. Fructose uric acid is wide open in the children that not only are cooking this, right? They haven't eaten it yet, but they are going to eat it. And when they do, they're blasting this wide open, and so are you. And this is the reason why you're walking around with 5 stents in your circulatory system. Literally, it is the reason. And I don't care whether or not you use whole wheat flour and 100% natural homegrown maple syrup right out of the tree. Okay, please just understand this, right? From an evolutionary point of view, the polyol pathway and fructose uric acid metabolism had a purpose, like other animal systems, and this is ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. That this pathway was there because when we did eat, we were able to rapidly put on fat, glycogen, water. We would stimulate our immune system. And this is the reason for this, was because we weren't able to get into the red state chronically, right? This was something we were doing intermittently. And our survival depended on our ability between food sources to have calories stored that we could burn, and to get water, molecular water, released as we burn those calories in order to get from one's food source to the next. Moving up, we have the pizza and the beer. And I like this one, especially for the gout sufferers, because in the pizza, you got everything, right? Polyol is going to be blasted wide open with this because you've got everything you need there. You've got the hyperglycemia, you've got the added sugars, you've got the umami in the meat, right? That's going to be the high glutamate, adenosine monophosphate, inosine monophosphate, yeast extract. That's what your food producers now use to get the umami. That's the that savory sort of, I call it the savory dark taste that comes in, especially with processed meats and so on. And then the beer has got it has everything also. High usually in these boutique type beers, you've got high carbohydrate content, you've got the yeast in there providing the purine load, and then you have the alcohol itself, which influences fructose uric acid 4 distinct ways, which I'm not going to get into here because it would take us into a realm of complexity again that a lot of my viewers push back against. The sushi upper right, that's here because this is something that I've encountered over the last 5 years a lot, not only in electronic forums, but also in discovery calls with people that suffer from gout, for example, and also type 2 diabetes. And you've got everything here too. You've got high concentrations of meat that have high purines in them. Now, if you're getting coached by me, you already know that I recommend that we not cut back on protein, that we actually can increase it, but we want to have a wide variety of it. So I'm not making an argument to you that you shouldn't have tuna. But in the sushi issue here, you not only have the tuna, but you also have a high load of white rice. And the soy sauce usually is going to have added sugar in it, along with, and I used to do this, I would add more salt to it, right? And salt opens this pathway in a combinatorial way when you combine it with the hyperglycemia and added sugars and so on, right? So sushi eaten this way is going to blast open the pathway. And then finally, down here on the right is what I would call the standard American plate of Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? There you go. It's breaded. And in an extended family situation where the argument had been made to me that, okay, Pete, we're aware of the added sugar thing coming from 2 individuals my age suffering from chronic metabolic diseases. We get it. We have listened and we have cut down, right? Here's what I saw. They made they made chicken that was smashed down into a thin layer, and then they breaded it. Okay, there you go. There's your hyperglycemia going into an individual that's suffering from cardiovascular disease that is being driven by polyol-uric acid metabolism. Boom, right? And then on this plate, we've got the mashed potatoes. So we take the carbohydrate and we mash it down into fine particles. Think timing and concentration arriving at the liver. We have a gravy in there that has added sugar in it, umami and so on. And then look at the biscuit, right? And the biscuit is like, that's bammo. And then we've got our coleslaw, which is going to have added, it's going to be a sweetened kind of sauce that the coleslaw has been made of. So this is massive. This meal is going to blow the polyol pathway fructose uric acid metabolism wide open. Now, where the problem comes from in the standard American meal, and you can listen to other influencers talking about this from a different point of view than I am, and I'm thinking of Ben Bickman. He gives presentations. He talks about, okay, here's what the problem is. we're elevating insulin right away early in the day, and we're keeping it elevated throughout the entire day. So if we switch the conversation to the insulin, and then we come back and we think about the fructose uric acid metabolism that's driving hyperinsulinemia and the insulin expression. The problem with this is that we start with this right out of the gate in the morning, and then usually with meal timing, and think of the medical establishment, you guys should be eating 5 to 6 meals a day, and there's, most families are eating dinner later in the evening. The insulin is elevated before it hasn't had a chance to come down before you even go to bed. And this is why decades into this that these disease platforms are rearing their ugly head, and even younger now, because again, I explained that issue earlier. So the argument that I've made is that we're operating here, that metabolic states are just that, they're states. And when we eat in a way that keeps the polyol pathway and fructose uric acid metabolism shut down, that we are existing mostly in a burning mode. That's where we have low glucose conditions, and the body is mainly functioning in a way which keeps the systemic inflammation, the disruption of nitric oxide, the storage phenomenon to low levels, because in theory, we only go into the red state intermittently. Now, eating the way most Americans eat, we cause this shift into the red state, which is driven by the hyperglycemia for adults, drinking the alcohol in the evenings, the umami, the added sugar, the fructose coming in. These things are usually combinatorial. And so we shift from the burning state into the storage state. And the storage state is characterized by the systemic inflammation, alteration. And I use the word alteration of nitric oxide because if we take a broader look at this, we know that the polyol pathway is being described in more and more of our tissues. The nitric oxide regulation and the ramifications of the red state will be different depending on the tissue, right? Because the pancreas is not the same thing as the liver. The liver and the pancreas have different functions. The brain has a different function than the liver or the pancreas. Skeletal tissue has a different function than adipose, right? These different tissues and organs have different functions. So I talk about alteration of nitric oxide signaling because what we see happen in the liver, you would not expect to be exactly the same type of dysfunction that you see happens at the level of the pancreas or, for example, in the skeletal tissue or in the brain. These are going to be unique alterations depending on the specific functions of those tissues. So really the goal of anyone who's out there is to eat in a way that keeps us in the burning state for the majority of our waking hours, and even while we're sleeping, by comparison to the shift to the red state. That's what the goal is. Now, I don't care whether or not you're a big fan of the plant argument, or whether you're a big fan of the ketogenic method of doing this, whether you're a big fan of carnivore. The bottom line is all of these ways of eating can serve the same function. If you understand that what you need to do is to have a situation where you are not shifting in a chronic way into the red state. That's the goal of any eating plan. Now, anyone who listens to me knows that I am a fan of the ketogenic, the low carb lifestyle. And in the early years of this, I was ketogenic, no more than 50 total grams of carb per day. And I eat meat. I elevate my protein. Nowadays, I have shifted that a little bit. I've shifted more towards eating more protein because of my athleticness, which is extreme for somebody my age. But I also occasionally will incorporate more carbs into my lifestyle, but I do this very, very carefully. When I work with clients, I advocate if they are suffering from a metabolic disease in a big way, like diabetes, then I take them low in terms of carb, very low. And then we move up. And I don't work with the plant people because I don't know that field very well, right? But what I can tell you is that you're not going to reverse diabetes unless you deal with the hyperglycemia. That has to be dealt with. Now, the purpose of this slide, its origin comes from Bitten Janssen, who I collaborate with quite frequently. And she wanted me to create a slide that can show you the vicious cycle here that we have without the hardcore chemistry. So in the upper left there, we have the standard American diet, which basically is characterized by the incoming of these macronutrients and combinations of these macronutrients. The sugar, which brings in both glucose and fructose, alcohol in the case of adults, usually at the evening meal. And again, I talked about this a little bit with the beer. The alcohol is a really big deal. I know that in the ketogenic space that they don't want to hear this, or the alcohol is a big deal. It has its biggest effect. There's a lot of question marks that are still out there. And quite frankly, a lot of molecular research still needs to be done. But we know, and I think that the biggest effect of alcohol is in the fact that it overproduces lactate, and it's a combinatorial thing. If you're drinking alcohol in a meal that is hyperglycemic, you're going to hyperactivate polyol pathway and fructose uric acid metabolism. So in the environment of a low carb way of eating, if you're drinking alcohol with it and the carbs that are coming in rise to a high enough level, and granted, what that level is, I would argue to me, is not known. This could cause problems with trying to reverse diabetes if that's what you're trying to do, right? Or to lose weight. And this is why I recommend, if somebody is suffering from a serious comorbidity, that you eliminate altogether the alcohol, especially probably in the first year in this lifestyle, and get the diabetes reversed. If you suffer from gout and you're drinking alcohol, I doubt very much you're going to be able to get into remission because the alcohol is a very powerful driver of the gout flare. And probably 90% of that reason is because it's activating this pathway. And you're having this sudden acute rise in uric acid, which happens regardless of where you are with your carb load. And when you have that sudden acute rise in uric acid and it moves out in the circulatory system, it freely diffuses into the synovial fluid. That's the joint space, all right? And it will interact with the chondrocyte that's there. And I don't want to digress here. I'm just going to say that sudden shift in concentration of uric acid drives gout flares, all right? And then we have the rest of the stuff going on here. Umami is something to take really seriously. So if you're eating a lot of processed meat or processed food, this is really a problem. It encounters the liver and the brain and the pancreas, right? And this is where the timing and concentration comes in. That's the upper center of my slide. And the time frame and the concentration matters. The tighter that zone is, the higher the probability you're opening this pathway. We generate fat synthesis, glycogen synthesis, the storage of water, systemic inflammation, blood pressure, and insulin resistance, which now on the bottom two circles here, the order of those two circles is not implied by this slide. But the importance is to understand that the longer you're in this vicious cycle, the higher the probability is that you're going to pop up with a metabolic disease, the obesity, the diabetes, the gout, and so on. And we are seeing the shift in gout into lower and lower years, younger people, all right? And this pathway drives changes in the brain, dopamine pathway, the plasticity of the neurons, right? The dopamine reward pathway. It activates a protein called delta phosphate. It activates vasopressin. Basically, it drives behavior to do what? To go back and to seek the very things that are making you sick, with a preference for sugar and even higher preference for fructose, whether or not fructose is exogenous, coming in from the outside, or endogenous, produced directly by the liver and in the brain, right? And in the brain. Important to mention that. So what is the first defense here? And the first is to eliminate drivers. So again, this comes back to this argument: what type of lifestyle should you lead? And I'm not going to get into a food war. I refuse to do that. Regardless of what direction you want to go, you have to eliminate sugar. You have to eliminate alcohol, hyperglycemia, and the glutamate. That's going to be the umami, all right? The processed food and the processed meats. And if you do that and you shift to a whole, real food, no processed food eating environment, this is where you buy food that looks like food, you cook, you cut it up and eat it. Your situation, and I can say this with 5 years of experience in terms of metabolic aspect of it, it's going to improve. This is just because people always ask me, so what does that mean? What are you eating? So this is 5 examples of what my breakfast looked like. I'm not going to dwell on it. And those of you that follow me have seen this slide before. You can see there's protein in here. There's lots of eggs. This is an amazing way to eat. It's very rich. And yeah, it is high in fat, right? But low carb, we burn the fat. All right, this is what my dinner plates look like. And if you notice anything at all, you can see the absolute absence of hyperglycemia here. There's like no potatoes and so on. And in recent times, if I do put a carb on my plate, it's going to be a small tablespoon size piece of fresh yam that's been minimally cooked. I don't eat regular white potatoes at all. I don't touch rice, any of the variations of it, and so on. No lentils, any of that business, because of the carbohydrate load. What are the barriers of this pathway? It's the understanding that you actually have to take what you're eating and make it at the top of your priority list, above everything. And the reason why is because up until this point, you have been eating to live, or living to eat. I said that wrong. You have been living to eat. And now you need to change that philosophy. You are now eating to live, right? This is an ancestral point of view. You need to make the time to cook. This is one of the biggest art pushbacks that I get. Dr. Peter, you kidding me? I'm busy. You know, I got things to do. Excuse me while I have a sip of coffee. I don't have time for that business. Well, until you make time for it, your metabolic profile is going to stay the way it is, right? You got to make time for it. And there's this issue with being open to new beliefs, because just about everything you think about eating at this point is not correct. You have been relying on epidemiological studies that have either been really done poorly, or even in the case of the medical establishment, withholding data. That's everything that has to do with the input of fruit, which is high in fructose, down to eating the issue surrounding red meat. All of this stuff is like, it's ridiculous when it boils down to it. You know, and this is one of the reasons why I rely so heavily on only talking about the well-done science that actually had controls when we address things like this. It's so super important, which brings me full circle back to the criticism I get because I'm always going too technical. Well, why do I go technical? Because most people that I work with, at least in the beginning and in the forums and for sure in the discovery calls, the pushback on this is in the extreme, especially like when it comes to fruit. Complacency is a massive issue. And at my age, I just heard this the other day, quote unquote, we all have to die of something. So I would put it out there to you that when you make a comment like this, and I can remember when I was in my 20s and 30s and I was pounding my beers and eating in ways that at least intuitive on some level I knew had to be problematic somewhere. Like I didn't have the time, the words weren't imprinting in front of my brain, but I knew it on an intuitive level. I was like, well, I'll worry about it when it happens. Well, I think that when it happens, you might not feel the same way. And for me, when I turned 60 and had this, this news about the prediabetes and the gout was coming on and all this business, I'm like, I wish I would have known what I know now back then. Because honestly, once you get to be 60 and now I'm 65 and you're thinking, how many years do I have left? And especially the boomers that are listening to the news, just think about all the people that we hear about who were contemporary with us when we were growing up that are dying in not only in their 60s and 70s. How are you going to feel? How are you going to feel if you're 72 and basically you're finding out that your life expectancy is now just a matter of months, or with the years you got left, you're going to really be suffering? How are you going to feel about that comment? Well, we all got to die of something. That's cavalier. And if you have grandchildren, which I do now, I have a grandson, how do you want to be with that kid, right? What kind of role model do you want to be? And what is going to be the quality of your time with them? What do you want to be able to do with them? And I can tell you right now, I want to take my grandson climbing, and I got to wait a while for him to get old enough for me to do that. And if I'm sitting in a nursing home by that time on oxygen with one foot cut off, I would never be able to look forward to that dream. Now, I'm not trying to argue to you that I couldn't be hit by a car or have some accident of nature, some genetically driven cancer. I'm not saying that stuff couldn't happen to me, but our metabolic health is something that we do have a lot of control over. We can choose to at least try to eliminate that variable, right? I would urge you to do something about it. And then the last thing I want to talk about before signing off is this issue of the pill, right? We see this right now with Ozempic and Wegovy, and the fact that people are taking these weight loss drugs without doing anything about what they're eating. And they see the weight loss. However, they're having these side effects. Why is that going on? Well, they're manipulating a hormone that is dysfunctional because of the way that they're eating. And then you're coming in, and this hormone has global effects, right? This is global. And they're coming in and they're taking a pill that's manipulating that without dealing with the underlying cause. So they are getting extreme side effects. Outside of the fact that they're paying $1,300 a month in some cases for these drugs out of pocket, they're dealing with the side effects. And then, we're starting to see this in the layman publications, right? In Reuters and AP Network, we're starting to see the papers rolling in. Well, when they can't afford the drug anymore and they go off of it, they're gaining all the weight back. Big surprise. All right. So I want you to consider what you've heard from me, and I want you to consider changing your lifestyle, because you can. And when you do that, all these things get better, and you will lose significant weight, and your gout can come into remission. type diabetes, we know it can be reversed depending on how extreme you've been in it and how long. For sure, you can get it into remission. And with that, I've finished. I know I'm at an hour, and I am focusing on the food and what you put in your mouth, because honestly, that is most of this issue. But I am not suggesting in any way that the exercise, the sleep, and the stress has nothing to do with this. These are also things that have to be dealt with. And being active is so super important, right? And I encounter in, again, the calls that I have in electronic environments, especially in our younger our younger age group, the age of people that are like my daughter, in their early coming into their early 30s. They're busy. They have, in a lot of cases, they have kids, and they're like, I just don't have the time to do this. Well, okay, listen. The time is there. It's a matter of rethinking priorities, and the food has to be at the top of it. You have to eat to live. That's number one. Number two, these other aspects need to be shifted to the top. Having the exercise and whatnot, right? Lifting heavy objects, which we hear from everyone in this space, and getting some high intensity work in. It can be a family thing even, right? This is very important. You need to dream. What are the things about that you used to dream about when you were younger? This is important, especially now. I'm talking to the boomers, right? Sitting there in our seats, drinking beer, watching, the football games. What are your dreams? What dreams did you have? Get off the couch and go get back into some of that. You can do it. And the issue is stress and cortisol. This comes up all the time. Yeah, it is a big issue, right? You need to think about how to de-stressify your life. And then the sleep issue, right? Most of the people with comorbidities, the diabetes, the obesity, the gout, suffer from sleep apnea, very, very high percentage. And sleep apnea causes the repeated episodes of a hypoxic, low oxygen environment throughout the night. And low oxygen, guess what, people? It opens Polyol-Fructose Uric Acid metabolism with a bang. And boom, if you don't deal with it in a very realistic way, you may have trouble getting reversal and remission and the other things that I've talked about. So with that, I'd like to close. I want to remind everybody that I now have a Patreon. It's going to have, I'm building it right now. At minimum right now in there is everything that you need in order to get gout remission, to reverse diabetes, and to lose weight. I'm asking right now, because it's Christmas time coming up here, for a $10 a month subscription. I've changed the way I'm doing this anymore because I want to make it affordable to everyone, but I also want to change the business model. To be upfront, I've been doing everything that I do basically for free for the last 5 years, and I need the help to keep doing this, right? So if you listen to me and you've seen improvement in your own life, listening to the things that I talk about, then I would appreciate your help. $10 a month right now. I'm going to keep it there for the next 6 months probably. There's also private chat in there, and all of the normal deliverables that I would give to somebody when I start one-on-one coaching. The basics are in there right now, and more is being added each week in addition to a private chat. So you can have the opportunity to be able to ask questions and interact with me directly. But anyway, I want everyone to have a great day, great holiday season coming up, and I will talk to you later. Thank you for your attention this morning.